All right. So now that we're all introduced, and all our guests, of course, are free. I think there's a function to comment, to pose questions. We will have a section dedicated to some questions, hopefully answers too. So whenever there's something you want to ask us, please use that function. So, I mean, what are we talking about today? The relationship between GPs and LPs. We have this Doriot Award, which will be bestow on some very fine scientists later this afternoon. And when you look back at General Doriot's first fund, which was the first private equity fund ever, we can say, he had the chance of collecting monies, from LPs, from insurance companies, U.S. insurance companies, and from some U.S. university endowments. So really, there was a cooperation, a huge synergy between GPs and LPs right at the start of our industry, which is interesting. And both Jean-François, Olivier, maybe we can hit it off by talking a little bit about the alignment of interests, GPs, LPs. So you are, Jean-François, you go into your fundraising, maybe for a co-investment fund, for a direct investment fund. And apparently you have to, whatever it is, pre-market or re-up or be in a closed cell with your former generation of LPs. What are the problems maybe from your side where we could improve, or what is the regulatory environment too in Europe? How does it look like, the AIFM regulation, when you approach your LPs, Jean-François?
Well, the alignment between LPs and GPs is for me, you mentioned science a few moments ago, more an art versus a science. But that being said, private equity is probably, the asset class which is one of the most aligned with the investors. There are strong alignment of interest around the carried interest, around the GP commit. So those are things we look, and it's definitely not anything new. There is also what I would call soft alignment of interest. Obviously, reputation is important. So we know that the GPs are not going to be doing stupid things, because if they want to raise a new fund, the reputation is going to be there for decades to come. Now, more to your question, what can be improved today? I think what we're seeing a lot these days are the famous GP-led transactions. And I think that's something which is relatively new, at least to the size of what we're seeing today. And that's something that we need to be a bit more careful of, and need maybe to take care of also in the LPAs. So for me, that's one thing that still needs to be discussed, to your question, around the alignment of interest. That's more towards the end of the fund. And this famous now GP-led is really something we need to pay attention to.
So yeah, and maybe we can elaborate on these GP-led transactions, partly GP-led restructuring, the fund of ones, the piggybacking topics later on. So Olivier, welcome again. What is your take on, as one of the major LPs apparently in France, what is your take on the relationship and the alignment?
Being an LP, I might have a slightly different view than Jean-François, but I would say the very principle that there is a reward for performance to the GP is healthy in itself. There are two issues, that being said. One is how big of a proportion the reward is when being taken from the total pool of value creation. And the second thing is, what is actually the value creation? In most schemes, we have a little problem, being that we reward the GPs for something which is not necessarily pure alpha, for something which is sometimes beta, and that is a major issue. So in principle, aligning interest via a reward for performance, yes, but there are big devils in the big details.
Very good. So maybe we can stay on that one for a moment. There's always the discussion, for example, Olivier, about super carries, where you say, let's really limit the management fee for the overall period. Let's maybe even talk about zero budgeting. When the first VC fund started in California, New Enterprise Associates was a large franchise such as, we do zero budgeting. So every year we do a budget for our costs. And I mean, it's still the 220 thing, but some funds consider, and interestingly, we should discuss it, offer to their major LPs. You know what we do? We limit really our management fee maybe to 1%, maybe even lower, but we want the 30% carry. So if we really generate alpha, we want more of the share, more of the reward. Maybe the two of you could comment on those super carry structures. What do you think of those?
If I start, sorry, Jean-François, I think it's, first of all, a function of what type of fund you are looking at. If you are looking at a small cap fund, even more if you are looking at venture, then a substantial fee is kind of normal because it will be more expensive to run this. And the last thing you want is your GP to do cheap picking.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about a big LBO fund, well, 2% is very rich.
Yes.
Now, the super carry, well, if it's a matter of changing the needle, moving the needle between fixed commissions and carry, in principle, why not? But again, my previous remark has to apply, i.e., the last thing you want is the carry to reward something which is partly beta. That is utterly unfair. And then when you compare your returns, having invested in listed equities and being exposed the whole time with your returns, with your private equity investments in which you have not been exposed the whole time, and most likely you will have been not exposed, and so probably back on index for listed equities at times when the market is not that good. So the internal rate of return will be very good and will generate a high carry, but that will be on periods when actually you will be paying for beta. So that is the big issue, in my opinion.
Yes, if I can only agree. And I mean, Jean-François, what is your take on such super carries? Are you guys considering to come up with it? Or if not, there should be good reason. And even Olivier suggested that we have to differentiate between, while track recorded, still start up, maybe first time VC funds that have to build their operations, and you really don't want to go cheap, right? So to put stress on those, say you have no money, just run. So Jean-François, what about the super carry arguments, pros and cons?
Yeah, remember, I'm more taking here the LP perspective because we are more private equity solution, fund of fund if you want, co-invest and fund. So as an investor, as an LP, we are, it's a market out there at the end of the day. And if you have to pay a bit more in order to get into better funds or funds for which you have a higher conviction, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is a net or what is our perceived net going to be as an LP. So yeah, we have to consider in some situations that in order to go into some of the top funds in some categories, we have to pay an additional layer of carry or a higher rate of carry. But we are looking at I don't know if it's alpha or beta, but we're looking at the hurdle rate. Obviously, it can't be a super carry at 8% hurdle rate, at least in my view. It has to be above a certain level. So we're not against tiered carry. But again, it's a question of what are we going to achieve on the net basis for us.
Right.
But maybe going very much along your lines, I would say, Thomas Lines, I would say we have actually applied a super carry structure in one of our mandates. So this is really saying that we're not fundamentally opposed to that. But if the return is very good, then we have no problem at all with the concept that the reward could be even higher as a proportion for the GP.
Yeah, and I agree. If you look at it, when has it been introduced? I might be wrong, but I believe it has been Kleiner Perkins that introduced the 30% within a VC fund. Interesting, but a very established franchise with the Silicon Valley options of generating returns. So let's put that aside for a moment. And Olivier, it would be interesting to learn a little bit more about FRR's, private equity team in terms of your team size, its qualification, and maybe your PE exposure with FRR, knocking it down to percentages, to the sectors currently addressed, target sectors. Where do you want to increase within private equity strategies?
Okay, the team is actually small because we don't manage a large number of funds in which we invest or mandates. But it is true that over the last few years, it has taken a lot of commitment from the investment team. The investment directors within the delegated management team have spent a lot of time on that. And the management of FRR, including myself, we have spent a lot of time. Yes. It's been a fight for us to gain the right to invest in private equity. We had problems with our investment horizon, and maybe the reputation wasn't exactly perfect in the eyes of our governance. Everything which is about 2 and 20, be it hedge funds or private equity, doesn't sound good for public institutions. That's the first attitude. We actually have invested in private equity with a very French bias. It is actually the way that we convinced our governance that there really was something for FRR in private equity. And we had, in a previous generation, in the years 2005, 2007, 8, invested in general private equity, geography-wise, Europe and the US. But that was a bygone period when we reinvested a few years ago. So now it's mostly a focus on France. And it is a big focus on venture and growth capital. We do not hate LBOs, but we don't like them very well in general. And when we do LBOs, it is small and mid caps that we think are okay. But the concept of putting debt on debt and making sure you slash the staff to the bone, that's a bit a caricature, but that's real world. You have it. So everything which is not a big LBO is much more reassuring for our governance. And we have not disagreed. Well, essentially, I will be blunt, but big LBOs, it is a function of equities, listed equities being expensive. It is a function of money being free in very large amounts. And it is a function of many investors having very good memories, because over the initial periods since the mid-90s, it's been a wonderful journey. So people remember it's been good. They know that anyway, listed equities are expensive, and they see, well, these guys should lever up to the head because debt is so cheap and available.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, it shows really that mid-market, even small cap strategies, that's then apparently a question of too much money chasing too small funds. But the return profile shows that there you really have the lever, there your analysis adds, because all the all the morning stars analysts do not cover private companies apparently. So you have more levers. And even buy and build, you would have enough money and still being able to forego too high of a debt ratio. So apparently returns pay off, because when funds really go bigger and bigger, something like 20 billion, I mean, you think that's a typo in the newspaper, but there are just analytically, it's getting harder to find targets where you put added value on, right? So we had this phase of pipe transaction, and everybody was wondering. So I pay carry for you, to invest in a listed company. Well, that's pretty interesting. So it's getting harder for them. When we look at the franchises, we are scientific. We discuss everything and analyze it. They really have to specialize more, so they have to increase the size. At the same time, specializing in technology sectors, not only geographies. I think that deal has been done already. So, Jean-François, the fund of funds, particularly, I mean, first we talked about fees. Of course, you have to earn money too, have to add a lever. When we talk so much about strategies, which LPs? I mean, you rightly said you are an LP in your own right, partly, but of course, always fund of fund. It's kind of a hybrid. So you address LPs too to invest into your funds. Which ones are ideally suited for the fund of fund structure on your take?
Yes, no, thank you for your question, because very often fund of funds, a bit less so today, but don't have a good reputation. This is a classic, additional layer of fees on fees. And obviously very biased here, but completely disagree with that, because I think fund of funds offer access, rigorous selection, diversification, and also, and we may touch on that a lot about, which is very often not seen, administration, cash management, compliance, regulation, etc., etc. And I think fund of funds, or we call that more fund solutions these days, are really well suited for two things. For niche strategies, for instance, if you want to invest, like we have this option, for instance, we offer these options, mid-market Asia, buyout and growth. You're based here in Europe, especially in COVID times, you can't travel. How do you make sure that you are selecting the right funds and getting access to these funds? A fund of fund or fund solution gives you that. The other, I think, target for fund of funds are sort of the small and mid-sized, either family offices or institutional investors. There is no way a mid-sized institutional investor based in Europe, Germany, or wherever can replicate what we can do with a team of close to 20 people in Paris, London, New York, Hong Kong, boots on the ground, really detecting these mid-market. We are more mid-market focused, right? Mid-market funds out of Minneapolis, which have, this overperformance. That's really almost impossible. So I think there is a big portion of the private equity market, and especially today, as some smaller, newer investors are getting into the asset class of private equity, there is a role to be played for funds of funds and fund solutions. Definitely, I think the funds of funds and hybrid programs, whatever you call that, are back into the middle of the landscape today. And when people tell me I can do it myself, very often I say, yes, go for it. And you'll come back to us like in 2 years, because you'll see that it's not easy if you have only 1.5 people to do the same in terms of diversification and quality.
I support that. We, in our portfolio of private equity strategies, we do have funds of funds. We have actually the three classes, funds of funds, venture capital, and growth capital. And when I was mentioning we do LBOs, actually the LBOs, small and medium-sized, are done via the funds of funds.
Yes, and I agree too. It's interesting that those strategies last. With the first dedicated fund of fund in the area of distressed investments, for example, New York led, and then there are some in the venture capital space too. Really, geographies like Asia. I mean, how do you firstly would try to get access to the top funds, not saying them top quartile. Absolutely. There's ample room for this. Also to get accustomed to the private equity asset class in first place. There's even a little room to say, I have done nothing. I'm coming from a little equity portion. I'm coming from historical 80%, bonds and govies. So what do I do? You better go with a fund of fund first, I must say, for the first phase, irrespective of everything. I think we agree. So then there is a fund, maybe let's talk about direct funds either, or fund of funds. And apparently you should take on as an LP a more active role, meaning there are limited partners, advisory committees to be stuffed inside the fund structure. And I would like to ask both of you, maybe Olivier, you start. Do they play a large role for you, for FRA, in France altogether, or are you taking more passive role, or does it depend on the type of fund?
I think the short answer is the latter one. It depends on the type of fund, and there is probably not enough granularity in our portfolio for us to be able to give the market answer.
Okay, so maybe then Jean-François, you would like to chime in?
Yeah, in terms of LPAC advisory boards, LPs advising the GPs, the first thing I'd like to note, this is not a democracy, right? This is really more the realm of larger LPs, sort of, unfortunately, I would say, because when you look at most of the LPACs, they are really composed of the larger LPs by construction of the fund. And then that's sort of the limitations of it, because larger LPs are either large institutional investors, large fund of funds, and they may not represent some of the smaller LPs or long-term LPs. So that's sort of the difficulties sometimes. And sometimes, when there are transactions with potential conflict of interest that go through LPAC, issue is, it's sort of the same kind of LPs voting in favor. So that's, that's the situation I can see. Now, how to solve that? Very difficult unless you have an LP vote. So that's maybe something to think about for the legals is, what needs to be LPAC, what needs to be more LP vote. And again, maybe back to where I started with the GP-leds, which are a hot subject these days. Is that LPAC today, or is that more LP vote? It's a huge Pandora box, I would say.
Yeah, it has room for structure. And is there a tendency, that would be interesting when talking about it, are there certain, I would say, smart GPs that actively look for smaller, with regard to their fund, I would say quality LPs that they want to push to a board role, meaning, okay, I have my cornerstone investor that's basically running the LPAC, but I really want to fight for this particular LP because he has a technical background in my age that he has, becomes more active. Are there smart GPs that make good use of the LPAC?
What I would say, it's relatively rare, because it's often actually the case that the larger LPs, sort of ask for LPAC seat when they commit to. So it's a bit difficult then to run a huge LPAC. This is not also useful. What we're doing, because we tend to be mid-market, smaller LPs in general, what we're doing is also, soft power. You can always pick up the phone, call the GPs, have a good relationship with your GPs. You don't need to be at the advisory board to have this connection. And I pretty much love that. I still believe that private equity is an asset class of a partnership. Legally it is a partnership. And it's also up to you to be able to do that, to reach out directly and give your comments and have a healthy dialogue with your GPs.
Right. Very good. So apparently in this year, I can't let you gentlemen off the hook without talking about ESG. And apparently, I mean, a lawyer by qualification, I see a lot of movements in the EU in terms of, taxonomy and the full disclosure guidelines and regulations. And everyone, as I mentioned yesterday in preparation of our funds panel this afternoon, we said, nobody knows it, the LP doesn't know what really to ask yet, and the GP doesn't know what to include in his documents. Yet we see that some are getting ready to prepare, kind of Article 8, Article 9 funds. Maybe both of you could give us your take on the ESG and how far it has found its ways into your documentation.
Olivier?
Okay.
Yes,
well,
Olivier.
I think there are 2 points here. There is form and there is substance. Form is becoming much more demanding because the EU-led requirement for more disclosure is filtering through everything. So not just the listed equities and bond assets, but also the unlisted ones. And it may be the case that those demands will not be perfectly adapted to the sphere of private assets because it has been formed mostly for the listed universe. I'm not saying more because I'm not saying it's going to be inadapted, but I'm saying it might be a bit tricky when something has been established with a consideration for listed assets. That's form. Substance, it has been present for a long time, and it is actually one of the positive elements that people don't think a lot about with private equity, because you are doing your garden very intensively. So each of your flowers, you know them perfectly, you love them, or you should, as opposed to doing super large quantities, surfaces, and then you don't know as well each of the elements. So that is much easier to integrate ESG in private equity, and the same for private debt, by the way, and all unlisted assets. And I would say it is not just easier, but it is a crux of the matter, because even in the listed space, if you think ESG is optional, then you've not been a good investor, because a lot of ESG is about managing your risks, knowing that besides looking at financial numbers, there is no nasty hidden risk that will pop up in 2, 3, or 5 years on the HR side, on the environment side, or there is something funny in the governance. So, I mean, it is integral part of doing a good job of selection, has always been and will always be.
Yes, so I hear from you that you would rather assign it to part of the risk management function. Am I right? Or
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this has never been optional. If you have been a good investor, you have always had a look at this as a risk element. Now it is also okay, I'll be blunt, it is becoming main field. It is also becoming a religion to some extent.
Yes.
So the risk side was a necessity if you were a good investor. The fact that it's becoming main field, you have to welcome it. The religious part, you leave it to the Ayatollahs. That's how I see it.
I'm not going to comment on that. Very good, but apparently some people overdo it, putting away the eye on the returns and just singing the green song, and that's apparently not enough in this asset class. I mean, Jean-François, what are you folks doing over at Quilvest? Are you planning for ESG fund, complacent with the new EU regulation? Where do you stand at Quilvest?
Well, I think regarding the EU regulations, really early days. We are still at the very beginning of looking at it and thinking about, how to comply with that. So I would park that for now. I like Olivier's metaphor of a garden very much. I think it's a very good metaphor. I may steal it from you, Olivier, at some point. I think for now,
well, we'll discuss the terms, okay?
Yes, IP from Olivier.
I think what we're doing now is regarding the legals, Thomas. I know you like the legal part. We manage that very often through a site letter. And a lot of LPs are actually doing that through site letters. We don't see a lot of terms around ESG in the proper LPA, because, you know, depending on if you're a Danish pension fund or a Spanish family office, you know, you may have different needs in terms of ESG. The other thing I like from Olivier is form versus substance. And we are really much looking at that because, you know, if you're a large cap fund and you're getting 2% management fee out of 20 billion, of course you can pay for very glossy magazines and brochures on ESG and beautiful videos and you know, a whole team dealing with ESG, and that's good. But if you're mid-market focused like we are, we accept that you can't produce all that with your management fees and the size of your team that you have. So it's very important that we are able to look at the substance and the rationale and the religion, if you want, around ESG with our GPs. And this is why it's very important to interact also on these matters. You know, for us, you know, ESG has always been there. You know, this is a French reference, but, you know, like Mr. Jourdain in Molière was not doing poetry, was, you know, speaking poetry without knowing it. You know, we've always been doing it, especially with our, you know, family shareholders. So it's not new. And again, substance is what is most important for us in terms of ESG.
Now, are there any questions from the audience? Maybe Laurent to ask? No. So yeah, apparently ESG is a huge topic, and I agree that it's still in the baby phase in EU regulatory terms, but otherwise has been there. I mean, from the very start of any investment, agricultural ideas about nurturing the ground, you know, you can take your start wherever you want. On the S side, you can go back, ain't gonna play in Sun City or even before. So it's not really new. Everybody's jumping on it, but let's seek more depth and never forget the returns, because it's always nice to have a hiding ground, you know, and sing your tune loudly when you don't accommodate for returns then. Apparently we are in an interesting phase right now, a terrible phase for parts of the business. If you look at hotels, restaurants, and the whole retail space, bringing it all the way, you know, to bricks and mortar issues we are facing. But how does that play out in terms of fund launches? What you see, maybe what you do yourself in your hybrid role, Jean-François, but also Olivier, when you look, you know, at the teasers that you receive in this year, is there a little bit change, accommodating for C19 maybe? Yeah, Jean-François, maybe you start.
No, your question is around, you know, committing to funds in 2021. Is that correct? What we see in the market? I'm surprised, to be honest, to see a lot of first-time team starting in France in particular, but also in other countries. So the way we tend to commit to fund is, first, we have a number of re-ups coming up, and we know the teams. You know, we can do an easy catch up over the video. That's no problem if we've known the people. It's slightly more difficult if we haven't met. I still think that, you know, there is an intuitu personae somehow in private equity back to, you know, partnership. So I think the way we're looking at 2021 in terms of committing to teams we have never met with is really to start the process right now on Zooms and videos and over the internet. and hopefully with things opening up, being able to meet with people in person at a later stage. I've been told in London that there is a lot of discussions called Walk in the Park, both for recruiting, M&A, and also PE investment. So this is our strategy. For us, it's important to still have this discussion on site with people.
Okay, Olivier, your idea about that?
Well, I'm not sure I have much to add to what Jean-François said, frankly. If I may make a joke, a walk in the park used to be something plain easy, but now if you do M&A and PE transactions through walks in the park, then that's a very different meaning.
Indeed. So, yeah, very, very interesting times as well. Maybe a minute about co-investments. This is also a flavor of the year. So, Olivier, I would like to start with you. Would you have the capacity? You mentioned you have a really dedicated team, but not a very large team. So do you see the capacities to go co-investment full speed? Do co-investment funds make sense for you? And then maybe Jean-François, what is your offering there?
Well, co-investment funds, that is a possibility for us, but co-investing alongside the GP in a fund in which we are a LP, unfortunately, that is not possible because our legal framework forbids us any direct holding in a company or a given asset. So the only thing we can do is invest in shares, bonds, or funds, which themselves technically are shares. So co-invest, unfortunately, which is a goodie, which can improve the returns for the LPs, it's very sad, but we cannot do.
But the way we're approaching co-invest for us is most often the case with our own GPs, and we commingle that with the primaries and secondaries. We do not offer a specific pocket for co-invest because we think that it all goes together, and it's an additional pocket of alpha, if you want, and slightly cheaper, to be honest, sub-asset class, because we rarely pay economics on co-invest. So co-invest for us is really not something on the side that is being offered. What we see usually in co-investment funds is really a large collection of 30, 40, 50, all kinds of things. For us, we like to construct it, engineer it a bit more, be super selective, and commingle it with the rest of our program.
All right, good. So any questions, Laurent, from the audience by now? You have questions for us, or are we already hitting? Okay. Okay, I mean, yes, you have it? Good. That's actually true. Okay, so what maybe yes, what can when GPs offer? I mean, you are both LPs. What would be your wish for GPs taking over your whole portfolio? What they should really do to have a better relationship? Is there any one specific thing that you run over frequently, or is it good because it's a partnership industry still? So.
I mean, for us, 2022, the way we're going to invest is going to be a continuation of what we've been doing over the years. You know, of course, there is always new things. We tweak things a little bit, but, you know, at the heart of it is really two things. It's really a partnership between people, between, you know, a team investing in companies. And for us also, it's to look at what is the value added by the team onto the portfolio companies. What kind of companies are being bought, and what is the value that is being added by the team. And has always been the case. So we really look quite deep into the portfolios, and in 2022 sort of going the same. Right. No, there's no reason to change that.
I guess so. I mean, that's why we have vintages, and we're stuck for 10 years. You better think a lot outside the process. As always, you cannot start early enough. Olivier, anything to close our discussion? And thank you both for being with us this early morning. Very much appreciated. Olivier, to close things up, any one recommendation for a GP that wants to get an FRR commitment? What can he do besides being able to generate alpha, we learned?
Oh, no, I'm not sure I can give many pieces of advice. Maybe one, if you can help us get more money to manage, then the pie will be bigger for everybody. But no, we are struggling with the investment horizon and the tendency that our assets are going down. We are to put it mildly, we are a very mature fund. It would be nicer to be in the teenage part of the life of an institution. We don't know what happens next, but that's the present moment.
That's the old Warren Buffett problem. Apparently, success leads to further room for problem solving, but a luxury problem indeed, as we are in France. Very nice. So thank you again, Olivier, Jean-François, for being with us.